Hello, chess fans. Today we'll be looking at a brilliant game from one of my favorite historical chess figures, Prince Andrey Dadian of Mingrelia. Actual name is a legitimate prince from the late 1800s in the nation of Mingrelia, located about where Georgia now is. As a prince, he played many brilliant chess games that he published in available periodicals, and he also sponsored many of the great chess tournaments of the time. Now, he has been called both the greatest villain in chess as well as one of its great sponsors and promoters in his day. We're going to look at one of his exciting published games, and at the end, we'll get into some of the controversy surrounding this fascinating historical figure. Prince Dadian begins e4, and after e5, he offers the king's gambit. Chess in the late 1800s was a romantic chess where aggressive players offered gambits as white, and black players were honor-bound to accept those gambits. This is a good example of that kind of chess, and it's certainly fun to look at. So black takes the gambit pawn and tries to hold on with g5. After bishop c4, g4 attacking the knight, we get kind of a Muzio gambit. Now, the true Muzio is to castle right here when black takes and white recaptures, and there is a ton of play on the f-file here, and this is just a ton of 1800s opening theory, and we're not going to get all the way down this rabbit hole. Instead, after knight c3, a similar kind of gambit is being offered, although it's probably not as strong as castling, basically because the knight on c3 shouldn't be as useful to white who's trying to attack on the f-file as castling would be. So this must be a little worse than the immediate castling Muzio gambit. So anyway, after knight c3 and captures on f3, white does castle in this position, and black should consider something like pawn to d5 or queen g5, looking for play, looking maybe to give back some material to free his pieces. Those are both recommended by Stockfish. Instead, bishop c5 check walks right into d4, which white wanted to do, right? You're opening up the bishop on c1 and you're gaining more central presence and you're attacking this bishop. So this is just great for white. Don't throw the check in on c5. After the bishop pulls back, white can either take on f4 or f3. He picks f4, and pawn takes g2. So this is a suicidal move. White is attacking on the f-file. Taking on g2 opens the f-file. There's not much more I can say from an analytical perspective, and the fact that bishop takes f7 is just crunching here and is like plus 10 for white is really, I think, all that needs to be pointed out to illustrate how bad taking on g2 is. Don't be so greedy if you're defending against a gambit. Get your pieces out and stop capturing pawns at some point. In any case, after bishop takes f7, if the bishop is captured, of course the queen is jumping in here, and this is a crushing attack. For example, king g7, bishop e5, major ouchies. You could also consider here king e7 and bishop g5 check, or even better than bishop g5 check is knight d5 check when you are checkmating next move. The checkmates include king up to e6, queen f5 checkmate, or king back here, and then you get to give bishop h6 double check and checkmate. Major ouchies in all cases. There are some other mates there, but basically black can't take the bishop on f7. So black tries king f8, sensible. We're just going to try to hide behind two bishops. Unfortunately, those bishops are also the opponent's attacking pieces, so that's usually not going to work out too well in a position like this. Rook f2 is played, which is interesting. I kind of like king takes g2 more, although both are really strong. I just don't understand why I want to leave this pressure here, although it really doesn't matter. The knight jumps into f6, and at this point, a really crushing move is bishop h6 check. All right, and there are other really good moves. Bishop h6 check, king takes f7, queen h5 check, the knight is pinned, very strong. And then after king here, this is actually a good reason for playing rook f2 instead of king takes g2. Rook takes g2 now is game over, knight blocks, and you take with checkmate. or actually after knight g4, you don't even need to check with checkmate because of queen d5. That's really cool. So, I mean, of course, taking the knight is game over, but you don't even need it. You have mate in 1 in any case. After queen h5 check, the king could also try running up, but here queen check, push the king back, and knight d5 is just game over on the f6 square. You're winning f6, and when you do, you're basically ripping apart all of the black pieces that are trying to keep you out of the black king's position. It is over. Stockfish says plus 20. I think enough said. So that was not played. Bishop h6 would have been game over. Also really good is just pulling this bishop back and getting ready to leverage, more pieces down the f file, right? Instead, in this position, Prince Dadian went a little crazy and played queen to h5. Now, this is a mistake, objectively, but I mean, White knows it's a mistake. I think that White is a strong enough player here to know that there are winning moves and that queen h5 might not be a winning move, but it's just too fun to turn down. I think that both players are just going down a fascinating rabbit hole at this point, and the queen sacrifice is offered kind of in the hopes of a brilliant game, and we get that. So after queen h5 here, of course, we're going to take the queen. If you don't take the queen, it's just lights out. I mean, you can then play bishop h6 without having to offer any sacrifices, and it's going to crush. It's going to be absolutely devastating. So the knight takes the queen. Bishop h6 check, and here's where black could have drawn. After bishop to h6, knight g7 does save the day. Now, you have a massive discovered check here, but whether you pull the bishop back on the diagonal leading to b3 or the diagonal leading to h5, you don't have better than a draw by perpetual, and we can show it on both diagonals here. It's the best you got. So a draw by perpetual. I should also point out king e7 here, and there is bishop g5 check in this position, but still you're going to have to settle for a perpetual. Eventually the bishop checks and checks and gives a perpetual check. If in this position black tries to be a little greedy and runs up with king d6, we have here e5 check, the king is forced to this square, and then bishop a4 is checkmate. I've never seen a checkmate like that. Maybe you haven't either, so that's kind of fun. In any case, black doesn't try to block with the knight, and to be fair, it seems like black might be able to win. The king has a lot of room to run here, and the coming conclusion to the game is really hard to foresee, so why block with the knight and take a perpetual when you might be able to escape and have an extra queen? The king runs up to e7, we get knight d5 check. The king is going to be forced all the way to the queen side with these checks, which a strong player can calculate. After king b5, we get a4 check, very nice. If the king takes, there is a beautiful checkmate in one with the two bishops catching the white or the black king in a queenside scissor maneuver that is very, very unpleasant for the black king. Beautiful checkmate pattern right here. Fantastic king hunt. So after a4 check, of course, black's not going to walk into that. Let's try king a5 instead. Now we get a really beautiful move from white, knight to d3, taking time out for a quiet move that prepares the bishop coming back to d2 and also potentially b4. The most immediate mate threat is actually b4, king back, bishop here, which I will show by throwing a nothing move in. And fantastic checkmate. Very, very beautiful. So backing up, instead of making a nothing move, we should of course try to find the best defense for black that we can. And the only way to try to defend against the coming checkmates is to move this bishop and allow your king left, a little room to run over here to b6. You have two choices, c5 or d4. It turns out the stronger move not played in the game is bishop c5, largely because you're gaining some control over b4, which is one of those mating moves that we were looking at. So After bishop c5, things get crazy. I'm going to give a long computer line that's basically forced. White does come out ahead, although who knows if both players would have walked this tightrope. Bishop d2 check, king back to b6, pawn takes. Now a great move c4, quiet move that seals in the black king, threatens checkmate here. It's another example like we had when we tried to move this bishop on b6. We need to make luft, and the only way to do it is pawn up to d6 so the king can run to d7. Bishop d5 check, king back, and strongest here is to take here, which is looking at rook f7 check, and also thinking about including the rook on e1. After pawn takes, rook f7 check is now stronger than it was if you had played it before taking on d6. Queen blocks, and now very nice, you capture here. So you've been able to capture twice on d6 and you're threatening the queen, so black is now forced to capture here. After queen takes f7, getting the rook for the queen, the most you can get for the queen in this position, you do not take back right away when it's fascinating and you might be okay, but you're not winning. Knight e5 check here sets up, after king takes d6, a fork, and white is going to be up in the final position, although it's still complicated. So basically, after best play, after white sacrificed the queen, other than the perpetual that we looked at, the king hunt does lead to an advantage for white, although it's very, very complicated. Jumping back, after knight d3 here, instead of the move bishop c5 that we just looked at, black tried bishop takes d4, which makes a ton of sense, of course, but proves to be the worst move and gets mated by force. We have b4 check. The king steps back to b6. a6 is similar. It does take white a little longer to checkmate. You can check the notes for the full details. a5 check, king a6, and b5 check. This is very important. The king is forced to capture, and c4 check, and the king can only run to 2 squares, and after going to either square, we have checkmate. This was played in the game, and knight to b4 was a fantastic checkmate. Just beautiful. Absolutely stunning final position. The king is driven all the way to a6. Most pieces are still in their starting squares, and you get mate with knight b4. And if the king runs to c6 here, you don't want to check with knight b4 because you give the king access to c5 that you're controlling, so you give check with the bishop instead, and that is a different and also beautiful checkmate in one. So I hope that you enjoyed this game. I want to talk a little bit about the controversy surrounding Dadian, and please do stick around because it's crazy. I'm going to link an article from the writer Batgirl on chess.com. She has a ton of original source material from periodicals at the time and journalists at the time talking about him. He's such a complex and interesting figure that I don't think you can get a full picture without looking at that stuff. And of course, this is over 100 years ago, so you really can't even get a full picture with that stuff. There's going to be a lot of subjectivity. So why has he been called an incredible chess villain? He's been called that because there's a lot of accusations that he fabricated these games. Like, he just totally made it up, just completely made it up. He's also been said to have published just his wins and not published his losses to make himself look better. I don't know anyone who really goes out of their way to publish their losses. I mean, your opponent can publish their losses, publish their victories against you, so you don't really have to publish the games that you lose. So I'm not sure that that's much of an accusation, although maybe he was misrepresenting, his scores, which is fair, and there might be some justification to that complaint. Regarding whether or not the games are completely made up, I'm inclined to think that they're not completely made up. I also don't really think that they're, fully legitimate either. I don't think it's a problem necessarily, and you can't really know the truth. It's speculation. But I'm inclined to think that they're played often in really informal settings. That's documented that he was often playing, not in tournaments with a clock, no talking between the players, no takebacks or anything, but in, houses with friends and such. He would host chess parties. And so people would be like drinking, carousing, I presume, having a good time, looking at different things. And moves like Queen H5, to me, don't feel like a serious game. It feels like something you're doing with friends, and you're like, what about Queen H5? And you play Queen H5, and then you just go down a rabbit hole, and you kind of play a game, but you're also like just kind of throwing the pieces around, and then you publish it in a periodical later because you're a famous chess promoter, so it's easy for you to publish the game in a periodical. So a lot of his games to me feel kind of like that. Like they're actual games, he's probably actually playing, but the setting is so informal that you can't really consider it equivalent to a real tournament game. It's maybe a little bit like Morphy's opera game or something like that, where he's throwing the pieces around and Morphy just skips past wins, trying to create the most beautiful thing that he can. The other piece of controversy relating to Dadian is that he had Chigorin, the great Russian player, removed from a tournament that he was promoting. Supposedly this was because Chigorin wrote some not nice things about him and his play in a journal, and he took quite a lot of offense to that. He was putting up some money from the tournament. So Chigorin went to the tournament, and then when he got there, Dadian said he can't play, which I think is just absolutely awful that someone would make the trip all the way to the event, you know, from Russia to, I think, Monte Carlo, and then they wouldn't be allowed to play. So that, I think, is like a real indictment of Dadian. But on the other hand, he did give Chigorin like more than the cost of third place, more than the value of third place, a lot of money to compensate him. And Chigorin said that he was well compensated for his time. So that's kind of crazy. I think that's pretty bad. But the games themselves, I think, are probably not entirely fabricated, although I think that their setting is going to be kind of weird. In any case, post your own thoughts in the comments and check out Batgirl's article. I will be posting more games from Dadian because I just find the games themselves fascinating, the era fascinating, and the historical figure fascinating. If you want to know when those come out, of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified of the future videos. Have a great day.